Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We have with us today Chris Dean and Monica Lloyd to speak about the work within forensic psychology and the area of extremism. Chris is a chartered and registered forensic psychologist, has worked for around 20 years, prisons, hospitals, probation, parole board settings. And from 2005 to 2015, worked at the HMPPS headquarters. This includes being a national clinical lead for various treatment programs, those working for those who've committed sexual offences, head of a specialist team who pioneered the development of evidence-based assessments and the development of preventing extremism offending and group-based violence. You've told us that in 2015, established the IdentifyPsychological Services Limited, and this is a company specialising in applied psychology to prevent violent extremism. And through this company, Chris has done lots of training and consultancy to government agencies, correctional services around the world nationally, and contributed significantly to publications. And I think you talked specifically about the Handbook of Prisons and Probation Services in Radicalization and Extremism. And if that wasn't enough, also doing Cardiff Metropolitan University, which is the registered psychology route, and is also a parole board member. I'm going to say a little bit about Monica, who is also a chartered and registered forensic psychologist, and initially working with the prison service as well, I think 12 years, before joining the HM Inspectorate of Prisons. I think you were head of research and development. In this capacity, Monica was part of the inspection of the Maze prison in Northern Ireland that took place as part of the Good Friday Agreement. She's spoken in depth to IRA and loyalist paramilitary prisoners, and this sparked an interest in the terrorist violence that was reignited again 10 years later when she rejoined the National Offender Management System Service, which is NOMS, to develop an evidence-based work for people who commit terrorist offences. And this was followed by a change to the University of Birmingham, where we've obviously got the wonderful doctoral course in forensic and clinical psychology, which is now amazingly in its 8th year. And you continue research into terrorist violence. So a huge wealth of experience. That's really great to have you. We're going to kick off with, how did you get into this and how did you get there today?
Okay. I've had a long history, obviously, so I won't go through all of it. It's been various different parts in different, but it's all been allied to forensic psychology, prison service and prison inspectorate for many years, and now an academic role. And I don't think there was ever a grand plan. It just evolved, and I just took opportunities as they presented. And I feel that I've been very fortunate, actually, to have the experiences that I have. The extremism interest sort of was sparked off, as I said, from getting engaged in the Troubles at that very significant time in our history, and speaking to some very interesting characters. I realised I knew nothing about the psychology of terrorism at all, but I had a crash course and tuition from the head of the provisional IRA, actually, who was one of the prisoners there. And then years later, with this new wave of terrorism that we've all lived through, it became a very important issue for psychologists to actually own and address, because there was a whole cohort of prisoners convicted under the Terrorism Act who were expecting to be able to be treated in the same way as other violent offenders, but we didn't really have an evidence base to do that. So we needed to develop one in short order. And it seemed like a very relevant and challenging project. And that was when I met up with Chris, and we worked together in that project, establishing some evidence-based products for risk assessment and intervention. At quite a difficult time when the country was still galvanised by the 7/7 attacks. So, and having worked there for 3 or 4 years, I then had the opportunity to take early retirement, but really wasn't quite ready to stop working. And in particular, I think Chris and I had done some original learning, which I hope we're going to share with you. And I felt that that would be quite important to put it out there, actually, before I properly retired. So went to the University of Birmingham, where I already had an honorary position, and was asked to set up this new forensic clinical doctorate course, which was a fantastic opportunity to do something which I think is really relevant to our profession. And so again, another privilege really for me to do, and set that up. And I'm still working on that course, but I'm using that as a platform as well for doing the extremism and the violence research, which I still find really compelling and interesting.
I think it shows the breadth of work that psychologists can branch out into, and it's lovely to hear people come on the channel and talk to us about all of these different areas. And I think what every one of them has said is how interesting they found each part of that. Even if they've changed direction, there's been something that's really gripped them.
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, I took what I call a classic route, in that I did my MSc, and then I was a psych assistant, a trainee psych, higher psychologist as it was at the time, and senior across prisons and YOIs. I then had a brief spell in the NHS before moving to headquarters for Prison and Probation Service, where I was a national clinical lead for various sex offender programmes. And then after a few years doing that, as Monica described, the opportunity came up to join this team. And I was encouraged to go for the post. I have a criminology degree as well as a psychology degree. So I was fascinated, particularly around extremism, terrorism, how I think you have to consider social circumstances a lot more, and political circumstances in terms of understanding offending behaviour, or particularly with that group. So that was part of my motivation for branching out. People also said to me that there was some similarities between working with sex offenders as a group because of their profile, some of the issues that they brought with this group as well. So that was also a reason why people encouraged me to move into this team. As Monica described, we then spent a number of years developing these products, interventions and assessments. And I went on to head that team as well, which was more about the full implementation across the probation service and prison service, as well as informing policy more. And then after that spell, I got to a point where I felt like I wanted to take a slightly different direction. So I left the prison service and probation service at that point to form this company. And I guess one of the main reasons behind that was trying to share that knowledge and experience with different groups of people in different ways, and developing my own skills and experiences as well, really. So from that point, I mean, it's been really interesting in terms of particularly working in different countries and working with different cultures, and kind of understanding their local experiences of extremism and terrorism, but kind of integrating that with the kind of Western background that we come from, to try and produce things that are meaningful for them, but also culturally relevant and tailored to their own experiences.
That's absolutely fascinating, and we will look forward to hearing more about that as the channel goes on. One of the questions that people typically ask us is, what does a day in the life of a forensic psychologist look like? Are you able to share a little bit about your days?
Yeah, I think it's very, and everybody will say this, it's hard to define a typical day, but within a day, I think it's interesting to emphasize it can be very diverse. So in the mornings, I could be, talking to a trainee psychologist, let's say, and looking at their development. And then in the afternoon, you can be in a meeting with kind of leaders of prison services in different countries, or drafting guidelines with NGOs, with people who aren't psychologists, but they're very much involved in this field, but they come from very different professional backgrounds. Through to then reviewing a piece of research or peer reviewing a piece of research. So I guess that just gives a sense of the breadth that you may have in a day.
Similarly, my day is very varied, really, because I have a portfolio of things that I do, like Chris. So there's no one typical day, and most of it is in front of a computer screen. And I'm connecting very often with students, or trainees, as we call them, on the course that I'm involved in, or their supervisors. And then I'm also involved in, I do quite a lot of speaking at conferences and so on, or being part of subject matter expert groups when we meet together and discuss how the research is developing. I'm a member of the Radicalization Awareness Network in Europe, and do a fair bit there. And so I've got used to teaching about extremism to virtually just your own presentation on the screen, when you just take it on trust that there's lots of people there listening and hopefully finding it interesting. So yeah, and I do reports for court, and so I'm quite often on a Zoom call with somebody who's facing a terrorist charge. So there's lots of different aspects to it, and each one of them I never tire of.
So I guess one of the questions, the big questions in terms of psychology is maybe what is extremism?
Okay, well, there is a government definition: the vocal or active opposition to our shared values, which include democracy, the rule of law, etc. So basically, I mean, extremist ideas are ones that would basically overthrow the current government. So, and that's why they're considered extreme. Or maybe they're not considered so extreme if you're living in Syria and your government is actually quite oppressive, in which case we might define that slightly differently. So it's always very difficult when you talk about extremism, what perspective are you taking? And so I don't think, I mean, if we talked about what's the definition of terrorism, it would be even worse. So, but I think we've all got a bit of an understanding, and extremist views are those that would harm our society. But we do need to make a distinction, which I think we'll go on to talk about, I'm sure, between holding extremist views and being prepared to advance them through violence, which takes you over the threshold into terrorism, which is something else again. And basically those who hold extremist views often come to the attention of the authorities because it is potentially concerning. And the key function that psychologists can help with is to actually identify those that perhaps you need to worry about and those that you don't. It's not an exact science by any means, but we know where the areas are that we might need to focus on that would give us cause for serious concern. And that would basically be what we identify as threshold behaviours, or the things that take you from actually having extremist views to being prepared to plot a terrorist attack and take it forward into violence. And the key task of risk assessment in this area is to be able to identify what those threshold behaviours and indicate and get a view about what sort of risk are we talking about, to whom and in what circumstances, you know, the nuances of risk assessment.
And it's interesting because I think, Chris, you mentioned sort of, and again, Siri as well, Monica, you mentioned that idea that culturally those thresholds will be different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the difficulty with these terms around extremism and terrorism. I think when you look at other types of offending, generally cross-culturally, people would kind of agree what is theft. Now, that may manifest slightly differently in cultures, but there's general consensus that isn't that controversial. When you begin to get into extremism and terrorism, then it becomes a lot more open to interpretation, and people may want to define it in ways that serve their own purposes, including governments. So it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And this is emphasized by, you know, the United Nations doesn't have a definition for terrorism because it cannot agree one, which is indicative in itself. I think just to build a little bit on what Monica said, I think it can sometimes be easier when we're looking at terms like extremism or terrorism when it involves illegal behaviour or violent behaviour, although even that can be difficult. But I think from a slightly, I guess, a psychological position, when you look at extremism, you will often see terms used like dogmatism or authoritarianism, or black and white thinking. These are the terms that are often used. I think from my perspective, and again, there are many opinions on this, but I think I see extremism almost as the imposition of identities, the imposition of values or beliefs, or ideas about how something should be. And I guess when you look at that further, or undermining people's identities or values and beliefs, and obviously the end point of that is where you are prepared to use violence to impose particular ways of doing things or ways of living. And I think when we talk about democracy and rule of law, I see those as mechanisms that protect people's identities from being harmed or being abused or violence being used against them. Now, people will contest that, and there's a lot of room there for argument and debate. But I think if we had to talk about that broadly, from my opinion, I think that's how I would see it, certainly extremism. Once we actually get into using violence and illegal activity or harmful activity, things become a little bit clearer, but that's when I would say people tend to get more into words or terms like terrorism or violent extremism.
There's definitely something important about the language used. I think it can be very emotive in this area. Is that something you found, that you've had to kind of educate people on the terminology you use?
Oh gosh, absolutely. First of all, the reaction if you speak to somebody convicted of a terrorist offence and you call them a terrorist, you may well rupture the therapeutic relationship before it started, because whether or not you perceive yourself as a terrorist or not depends on where you're sitting with regard to what you want to do. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, is the well-known expression. So you're making a judgment politically about somebody and using that word. So we learned very early on not to use that word when we talk to those convicted of terrorist offences, and that was what you would say: you're convicted of a terrorist offence. I mean, that's not controversial, that's fact. And then you move on from that. And the word itself, I mean, it's the clue is in the word, isn't it? Terror. It does inspire fear, and amongst many people who are tasked with understanding it and managing it as well, because people nobody who's involved in that process wants to be the person who makes the wrong decision.
Yeah, and I think, just to build on that, I think, the term radicalization as well is one that I think is particularly problematic. And this was a term historically that only started getting used in about 2002, after the 9/11 attacks. And this in itself is really interesting, because this is language that's used everywhere now, and it's so easy for people to have different interpretations of that. But as psychologists, again, one of our experiences was, whilst initially we challenged this kind of term because we saw it as not that helpful, to engage with other stakeholders. And again, this field is a particular field where you have to engage with lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds. There's a lot of people in this space. So again, I think sometimes, and again, this is just my perception, when we deal with sex offenders, by and large, people are quite happy to kind of see sex offenders kind of being treated in rooms by psychologists. But when it comes to terrorism, there's a lot more people who are interested and feel that they have a voice or want to offer their opinion or views, and through their roles, they have to get engaged in this space. So I think we found that, we have to be pragmatic as psychologists with this as well. So if we have to use language to engage in conversations, to build credibility, to be heard, to help, sometimes you have to use language that you may not fundamentally or necessarily agree with or think is helpful, but there's a degree of pragmatism as well. And I think that continues to a degree. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and shape or continue to shape language that's used. But yeah, I guess it's an important area.
So the next question we wanted to know is, what's the psychology behind why someone might commit an extremist act?
So I think for me, what's more important is the questions about what can psychology tell us about why people become interested or involved with groups, causes or ideologies that may support violence or illegal acts on their behalf. What's the psychology behind why people may become identified with these groups, causes or ideologies that support violence or illegal activity? And again, just to make that distinction, that I think when we talk about people becoming identified with groups or causes, psychologically, I think it's a slightly different thing from people who just become interested about these. So when we talk about identity, or how I conceive of this, is where someone's relationship with a group or cause becomes fundamental, or more fundamental, to who they are as a person, how they define themselves, how they live their lives day to day, compared to someone who may kind of get involved on the periphery because they may have a friend who's interested, and so on. And then I also think there's questions around, and then even if people are interested or involved or even identified, what can psychology tell us about, or what psychological processes are going on that means someone is then prepared to facilitate or commit acts of violent extremism or terrorism as well? What can psychology tell us about that?
Well, there's a differential in roles, isn't there? And I think there's a broad distinction between group actors and lone actors to be made as well. In groups, a range of roles, not everyone is prepared to strap a bomb onto themselves and carry out an act of suicide martyrdom. But there will be others who will be prepared to raise funds or distribute literature or give indirect support. So, and they're all going to have a different psychology. And when it comes to lone actors, what you've got there is an individual who is prepared to take responsibility for all those things on themselves. So they are, I mean, the research would indicate that lone actors are fundamentally very much more disturbed and very much more fixated on there being only one solution to solving their problems. And those problems are very often single issues, they're not necessarily shared ideologies. So they can have a very idiosyncratic belief system and be on a mission to create that. And quite a lot of the narcissistic sort of mass shooting that we see in the United States will come into that category. So I think lone actor psychology, you might want to look at that a little bit separately from group actor psychology. And all these things have got implications for the level of risk that one individual can pose to society. But also I would say that the motivation at root is always personal. Unless you're personally hooked in, unless you can see that you're solving some of your problems through adopting this political cause, then you're more likely to be protected from becoming engaged. Now, I think we need to put the word protection in quite soon in this whole discussion, because most people who are exposed to the same political context and have maybe some similar personal susceptibilities are usually protected from crossing that threshold and becoming a terrorist, from having basically a good enough life, from having an alternative life, a sense of self-esteem, a strong identity, a sense that they can make progression in life. They've got a pathway that they're following and they don't want to diverge from that. But those who can become seduced by the idea of adopting an extremist ideology and perhaps even taking on making the additional step and contributing to a terrorist plot or becoming a terrorist, they're all pursuing different personal needs, which they've projected into a political cause, and they have got personal needs that will be. They believe will be met by engaging in an extremist group or ideology and ultimately pursuing the cause for them. Now, there's no one single pathway, but basically the underlying needs are for status, identity, meaning, belonging, respect, and not just respect, but also a sense of supremacy as well, because all extremist narratives offer not just equality, but supremacy. And so it's usually those who have felt, have actually, research would suggest, been a victim of violence themselves and been bullied in their early life and experienced trauma, who want to become the persecutor rather than the victim, and will flip it so that they become concerned with establishing supremacy and usurping the persecutor's power. So that dynamic is very often at work. And so the personal is projected into the extremist cause. And that's the underlying psychology, I would say.
Equally, when we look at women and we look at children as well, and that's not to say that women can't share some of the pathways that Monica's just described or I've alluded to before, but I guess just to kind of give counterpoints, you know, if let's say you're a woman or a child in a conflict zone, and your psychology may be, if I don't engage in these acts, I'll be killed or I'll be raped. That presents a very different understanding of the psychology of engagement in these acts or facilitation of acts to perhaps what Monica's just described. And I only raise this just because I think it really illuminates that we can never assume with individuals exactly why they may be involved or have been involved in the past, and just to illustrate the diversity of potential pathways and psychologies behind these particular behaviours.
I was thinking, which makes the risk assessment and assessing people really tricky, because if you've got this diversity of pathways in, and you've got, you know, this idea that culture is so important when you're assessing people's risk of something, the internal, the external. How did you manage to develop risk assessment around this area?
I think we were very mindful that this was, because this was such a new area and it was a very sensitive and had its controversies linked to it already. And again, Monica's alluded and outlined some of those. But I think what we also realised is people have to start somewhere. In developing any assessment for a new group, people have to start somewhere to build a foundation on which you can evolve as new knowledge and research comes out. So I think with that conviction, or reminding ourselves of that conviction, that helped us to move forward. So obviously, you know, as you would expect, you know, it was looking at international research, it was looking at those with experience in different jurisdictions in the world to help understand factors. It was not neglecting, you know, the decades of knowledge around risk assessment that we already have with other groups, and asking questions about how much of that is applicable to this group. Just because it's a different type of offending and offender, that doesn't mean that this suddenly immediately becomes invalid. Having those discussions, working through those questions, and really kind of amalgamating those two. So building on what had been done before in terms of process with risk assessment, working with a group of experts who had expertise both in this particular subject or field, as well as those with particular expertise in risk assessment and risk management generally, to create something that we felt had enough validity and defensibility to move forward with this group.
We were also advised that this was the best place to start, because you're not bringing preordained ideas into it. You're actually you're carrying out a functional analysis, basically going back to the basics with individuals, and you're identifying what need is this meeting in this individual adopting this ideology or joining this group, and what were the circumstances that applied. And then gradually, when you do lots of individual functional analysis, you begin to identify some patterns, and then you think, yes, actually that's a key risk factor. Let's include this in a framework. And we developed an initial framework, which then went out for independent scrutiny before we got some feedback and adjusted it to be the framework which has now become adopted by the criminal justice system, basically. That's the extremist risk guidance framework, with 22 factors and a plus suffix. And the plus is acknowledging that we don't know that we've got it all. And if anything else that's relevant to this individual comes up, then add it in.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to this question. So a big question for the profession was, or not even just for the profession, for the field, you know, do we need distinct risk assessments for this group? Why don't we just use what's already in existence, the HCR 20, if we're assessing violence, let's say? And again, there's been publications about this very issue and research. But I think it was acknowledged, and it continues to be largely acknowledged, that there do seem to be distinct risk factors or vulnerability factors and/or protection for this group, or certainly individuals within this group, that require that slightly distinct approach. Now, that's not to say that some of the risk factors that we would assess for other types of offender may not also be relevant for this group as well. So particularly, let's say, if we are looking at people who we have concerns about or have a past history of committing violence itself, actually looking at risk factors associated with general violence can be helpful in terms of building that case formulation, or those risk factors that we need to consider and manage going forward in the future. However, I guess based on what we've already talked about, I think it probably, for people watching this, it may have raised ideas in their heads about this sounds slightly different to areas that we may look at before. So for example, when we talk about demonization or dehumanization of members of specific groups, that isn't something that you may typically look at, with the exception of maybe if you were looking at gang members. Maybe if we look at a factor like over-identification, let's say, with a group cause or ideology. So again, this is that idea that I talked about before, where somebody's relationship with a group becomes so important to them that they may be almost prepared or willing to do anything on behalf of that group or cause. That isn't something that we would ordinarily look at with, let's say, a sexual offender.
It's so fascinating. One last question about this, because it is so interesting. You mentioned vulnerability factors, and the reason I mention it, I had a colleague who worked, interviewed somebody that was working with somebody that had committed an act of terrorism, and I think she was quite surprised by his presentation, being quite, I suppose, a vulnerable person, in some ways quite suggestible, perhaps, thinking along the lines of some complex personalities. What do the vulnerability factors cover in that sort of area in your assessments?
It might be worthwhile just mentioning that they, what I've discerned specifically is 3 broad pathways. The first one, I think, is the one that we thought would account for all terrorist offenders when we started the work, which is a noble cause pathway, in which individuals adopt what they tell themselves to be a noble cause, in which it justifies, the ends justify the means, so that if you're wanting to bring about positive change, if you've got to cause collateral damage along the way, that's what you do. And it's all done in a political cause, and it could almost be represented as altruistic. Well, I think there were some people who did conform with that approach, and they didn't have a criminal background, which is actually the more common pathway, is that people already will have a criminal, if not a violent background. But the noble cause pathway was sort of characterized, if you like, by those who'd perhaps gone to university and were from an Asian background, where they felt quite a lot of cultural challenge being in a university amongst westernized young people who had a very different value base to them, coming from a Muslim background, but who also felt quite humiliated by that to some extent, because they felt that they diminished by the fact that they weren't able to enjoy their freedoms, if you like, these newfound freedoms, in the same way that others were. And then sort of bonded together, and then started to look for something that would characterize them and allow them to feel, well, to restore their self-esteem and to feel worthy, and then can get drawn into a narrative about the superiority of Islam compared to the decadent lifestyle of the West, and so on. And then gradually, in a series of steps over time, become more and more embedded in that, and then decide that they need to do something themselves to bring about this this improvement that they believe is necessary. That's the sort of the noble cause pathway, and there were many who conformed with that. And then we came across others who were actually criminal, in the sense that we'd become very used to dealing with criminals who had a background in criminality and thrill-seeking and attitudes that justified offending and violence, and who didn't really have any inhibitions to overcome about committing an act of terrorism, and were persuaded that the engaging with an extremist ideology would almost launder their offending, because it was justified when it was against those who were unworthy. And it also gave them perhaps a proxy family and sense of belonging and a positive identity, which was very different from the one that's projected onto them from society as career criminals. So then they find that their criminality is actually an asset, because it increases their capability of being able to assist with an extremist offence. So that criminal pathway has been one that is almost more recently gained in traction since the war in Syria has ended, and some of the exhortations from ISIS have been to carry out lone actor attacks in your own country. Don't even travel to Syria, just do what you can where you are. So encouraging acts of terrorism, and that's usually been taken up by those who've got some experience of criminality and of violence. And so that criminal pathway is quite different to the noble cause pathway. And then there's another, I think, very much smaller pathway, but which certainly as psychologists we mustn't overlook. And that is those that have got disorders of thinking anyway, either through psychosis, delusional disorder, perhaps extreme autistic spectrum, and or those who have developed just overvalued extreme beliefs because of their personality, because they are particularly narcissistic, isolated, authoritarian, and they decide often more often as a lone actor to actually do something which is all about them and about achieving renown, because there is this drive amongst many to be recognised, but maybe it's a narcissistic need, to be recognised as somebody who's special and is prepared to make a difference. So I think broadly speaking, there's three pathways of noble cause, criminal, and possibly clinical, are worth bearing in mind, because it helps you make broad distinctions. But each of those within those categories is going to have an individual pathway as well.
So we were wondering whether there are, what interventions are available for those who have committed an extremist offence, and even if there is a unique intervention that is needed, or whether other interventions are available.
So obviously the main psychological intervention or psychosocial intervention is the healthy identity intervention. It has a particular emphasis on identity because I guess identity issues seem to be relevant to many of these individuals, not all, but many of them. And it very much focuses on trying to understand the role that some of those issues played in terms of interest and involvement with these groups or causes, as well as the contribution that identity may have made to making people prepared to offend as well. And again, just to go back to what I said before, you know, where people are particularly identified with these groups or causes, that may impact on the perceptions of groups that they may have. Things like beginning to demonize other groups, beginning to dehumanize other groups, which may make them more prepared to facilitate certain offences or commit violent acts themselves. So they are just some of the areas that I guess are considered within something like the healthy identity intervention, and similar interventions as well. But I think just to broaden that out a little bit, you know, there are interventions as well that specifically focus on ideological beliefs that individuals may hold, and working with individuals to try and encourage them to re-examine some of those beliefs or reconsider some of those beliefs or ideas, particularly where they seem to have a direct link to their offending behaviour as well. Now, clearly that's, psychologists may do that to some extent, but often that requires other professionals to do that work, particularly where that's theologically orientated, or where it's where it requires specific knowledge of particular ideology, let's say far-right ideology. And then there are what you can call practical interventions as well, which is more about focusing on, particularly when people are being released, focusing on their reintegration needs, surviving day to day in society, trying to enable them to reintegrate as effectively as possible, to support them with that.
What are the sort of current challenges people face, especially when working in this this way, perhaps with people that have committed these offences?
When it comes to making the decision as to whether to charge somebody with a terrorist offence, I think we're looking maybe more at the CPS probably than the police. There you've got, you haven't got the general understanding of the importance of distinguishing between engagement and intent. And so I've seen quite a few people who I've actually done reports for court for, who have been charged with, under the Terrorist Act, with terrorist offences for behaviour that were fairly benign, but which have been criminalised under terrorism acts. Things like, you know, having certain information in your possession that could be useful to a terrorist, having information that glorifies terrorism or extremism, things which we would not expect to be criminalised in a Western democratic country. You'd expect that to be more associated with totalitarian regimes. So when these offences are fairly mild and reflect engagement with no evidence of intent, then charges can be brought which are really disproportionate with the actual degree of criminal intent. And I think then there I'm noticing there and among the judiciary, dare I say this, a lack of familiarity with how you would try and make risk discriminations in terms of a terrorist offender.
And then there are also challenges about the role of psychologists in this field anyway. You know, many people argue that, you know, this is a social political issue, and psychologists shouldn't really be involved, or their involvement should be minimal with these issues as well.
As we draw to the close of this episode, two of the questions that we always like to ask our guests is, what has been your proudest moment in your career so far?
I was actually quite quietly thrilled with the decision that the British Psychological Society made when they conferred on me fellowship of the society. And I thought, oh gosh, you know, because, you know, I mean, I don't think psychologists are necessarily motivated by those things, you know, getting titles or anything else. I mean, maybe some are, I don't know, but I'm certainly not. And you just do your best. And you take opportunities that present where you think you can make a difference. And I've done that over the years. And then it was surprisingly nice just to have those efforts validated, actually, by getting fellowship of the society.
I think it's a really hard question, because I think pride can come from working with a case where you see progress still, amazing progress, or, you know, things like that, or trainees, you know, getting through chartership. So I think it's an ongoing thing. But I guess, and again, this may sound really egotistical, but because I was thinking about this, because I know you'd raised it to think about. But I think in terms of a moment of time, one of the things that I did was, obviously I co-authored guidelines for the Council of Europe in this area across correctional services across member states in European Council. And I did a presentation to many senior leaders from those services. But I think why I was most proud about it was, I think it's because I'm a psychologist, and I was speaking to a lot of people in very senior roles who aren't psychologists. Now, a lot of that guidance isn't psychological in its purest sense, but a lot of it alludes to psychology, and it has a lot of it's framed in psychological ways at points. And I think the point about that particular moment was, I think it's really important for psychologists to be seen by people who perceive psychologists to simply sit in a room talking to people about their problems. And I think whilst that's really important and fundamental to what we do, I think using psychology to influence people in different ways and to be perceived by people in different ways, to think actually these psychologists talk about things or bring things in different ways that may be actually quite valuable in different ways. And I think this goes into other work I do now in other places. But I think that's the reason why I think it's a particularly proud moment.
As a trainee in the middle of submission stress, it's very nice to hear you say that proud moments, seeing your trainees get through. It's a joint venture, and it's just nice to hear.
So what are your future plans, aspirations, or just hopes for this area?
So I'm really hoping that there will be some changes in the law at some point, when perhaps politically things have changed, because ultimately in this area of work, the solution will be political. It won't be psychological. It won't be correctional. We do our best, and I think we do really useful work. But what will change, for example, Islamist terrorism will be political change, probably in the Middle East. You know, so and then we won't have people who feel driven to assert their difference through violence. And so when we get to the point where we recognise that we don't need to have these fairly more extreme legislation, that we will pass more legislation which will actually be more respectful of our right to be different, because we will always have criminal law which will always criminalise violence, so we can, and we all agree on that. But it is important that we don't pathologise political violence, criminalise beliefs permanently.
This whole field has opened up many opportunities as well in terms of who we work with, different stakeholders, how we work with them, how information is shared, how psychology is perceived, the value of psychology, as well as more theoretical developments as well. And I think some of this, or what would be nice to think about in the future, is again a bit more reciprocation in terms of some of this knowledge feeding back into some of those other fields, and vice versa, really, because I think that's how things evolve, and that's how things develop, and I think that's really important.
Thank you both for coming on the channel. We've really appreciated you, and people that are watching, there are lots of links associated with it, so go and have a look at the research that's out there and the links that Monica and Chris have provided for us. And the last thing just to say, let's talk forensic psychology.